Welcome to A Considerate Life. I'm Dr. Jerome Thomas Bridges. Today we're going to talk about what I call cumulative evil and the role of faith. Last time we talked about the problem of evil and the mystery of evil, focusing on the mystery of evil, the sort of existential experience of suffering, if that's not redundant, which it is. Today we want to talk about one of the things that happens to us. It's more of a psychology of the problem of evil, I should say. I want to talk about what happens to us when we read atheistic arguments that mount up the varieties, types, amounts of evil in the world. So, cumulative evil and the role of faith. I want to start off with the prologue to Bertrand Russell's autobiography. Now, in the prologue, he says something that I find extremely interesting, very transparent, and I'm going to use it as a lead-in to answering this question of what happens to us when we list off these kinds of evils in the world. So Russell starts out by saying, 3 passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, and an unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. These passions, like great winds, have blown me hither and thither in a wayward course over a deep ocean of anguish, reaching to the very verge of despair. I have sought love first because it brings ecstasy. This is what I sought, and though it might seem too good for human life, this is what at last I have found. With equal passion I have sought knowledge. I have wished to understand the hearts of men. I have wished to know why the stars shine. And I have tried to apprehend the Pythagorean power by which number holds sway above the flux. A little of this, but not much, I have achieved. Now, that's a little bit modest because Bertrand Russell was a great mathematician. Love and knowledge, so far as they were possible, led me upward toward the heavens. But always pity brought me back to earth. Echoes of cries of pain reverberate in my heart. Children in famine, victims tortured by oppressors, helpless old people, a hatred burdened to their sons, and the whole world of loneliness, poverty, and pain make a mockery of what human life should be. I long to alleviate the evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer. So here we have Bertrand Russell being very candid about these things that have driven his personal life, his academic career, and then his ongoing tension with the notion of God itself and then religion in general. He was a lifelong atheist as far as I know. And so what this shows me is there's this way in which the stacking up, the accumulation, the cumulative evils can be stacked up in such a way that it drives us to despair. He says it brings them to the verge of despair. Now, cumulative evil, the way it works, the reason it works, is because it has these very undeniable elements to it. There's genuine pity. If someone was a complete misanthrope, completely apathetic to the plight of mankind, this wouldn't be a problem, because they would be just this narcissistic, self-absorbed, out-for-me person. But having genuine pity for others, this genuine empathy, it causes pity for those who are experiencing suffering. There are horrendous evils in the world. Now, it's not just the existence of suffering, but it's the existence of suffering, the amount of that suffering, and the varieties of suffering. Right? We're not denying that. There is suffering in the world. There's a tremendous amount of suffering in the world, and the varieties of suffering are practically endless. And then finally, as we start contemplating this existence, amount, varieties of suffering in the world, we reflect on our own impotence, our inability to match or meet or solve this problem of the suffering of mankind, and it becomes paralyzing. Now, earlier in the very first video, we talked about the difference between theoretical reasoning and practical reasoning, or theoretical consideration and practical consideration. Theoretical is aimed at the truth of things, and practical is aimed at what I should do. Now, hopefully this channel is trying to take some things from the contemplative side of things and bring them into the practical order. But just noting the fact that practical reasoning is about this, it determines an end. It would be great to alleviate the suffering of mankind. and then it determines the means to that end, and then it chooses the most proximate means. So this is how we order what we do. The lists of the existence, amount, of varieties of evil drive us to despair because such lists paralyze practical reasoning. There's no real first step for us to take. Now, there are some people who, when they get involved in causes like alleviating starving in Africa, or the need for fresh water or clothing, right? Food, clothing, shelter, right? So they engage in these philanthropic efforts that are just a few steps into the desire to alleviate some aspect of suffering, whether it's hunger or health or shelter, things like that. But notice Bertrand Russell ends his litany with this. I long to alleviate the evil, but I cannot, and I too suffer. So not only are we're participating, right? We're participants in a world that is sometimes too filled with suffering. And given the finitude of our lives and resources, given that our lives are finite and that our own personal resources, even our emotional resources, are finite, the magnitude of evil and suffering in the world overwhelms us. So because these elements of this the cumulative evil, genuine pity, horrendous evil, the sense of personal impotence, these aren't wrong, then what are our options? Well, one of them is atheistic despair. We saw that in Bertrand Russell. But another response is what has been called by Schweitzer misotheism. This may be a new term, but I think it's apt. He says this: simply put, misotheism is a response to suffering, injustice, and disorder in a troubled world. Misotheists feel that humanity is the subject of divine carelessness or sadism. They question God's love for humanity. So this is the idea that I don't think God exists, but if he does, I hate him, right? Now, this is why this is titled Cumulative Evil and the Role of Faith. So we saw that despair, atheistic despair, and misotheistic hatred are responses to the suffering of mankind. But another response to the suffering of mankind is faith. And we're going to talk about what role does it play. We'll see that in a second. Jesus says this in John 14, do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. Atheistic despair is a proper response to cumulative evil proportionate to our finitude and weakness. If all we had was the suffering of the world and my own lifetime and my own limited resources, despair is a genuine response. It's a live option. Misotheistic anger is a proper response to the perceived injustice that permeates life. But as we'll see, it's wrong for them to turn that hatred toward God, and this is why. Faith is not a blindness to the suffering of the world. We're not making light of it, and we're not blind to it. What faith actually is a response proportionate to eternal power and divine love. So when the theist sees the suffering of the world, they're not minimizing it, but they're also not looking at humanity or individuals as the resource to meet that problem. What we're doing is we're saying, I can't solve this problem, and you can't solve this problem, and we perhaps cannot solve this problem, which is a humanistic response that we can solve this problem. Faith says, I can't solve this problem, you can't solve this problem, we can't solve this problem, but there's a God whose power is sufficient to solve, and his love is an inclination to solve this problem. So evil will be vanquished at some point, right? We see this at the very end of the book of Revelation, where he dries our tears, solves all the problems of humanity by simply showing up and being who he is. Now, as I say, faith is a proper response to cumulative evil and this paralysis of practical reasoning. It demands the question, well, what is faith? And what we'll see next time is faith is a term that can be used in different ways. In this context, we're talking about faith as what we called a theological virtue. It has its origin in the Holy Spirit, and it has its object as God. It's for believers, not non-believers. And so it becomes this resource for responding to this paralysis of practical reasoning. But faith can be used in other ways. The term can be used in other ways, and one of those ways is as a mode of knowing. So next time we'll talk about faith and reason as two modes of knowing. Now, so we're sort of leaving the context of the problem of evil as sort of part one and part two. And now we're getting into the question of faith and reason. So again, we'll try and find a balance point between two extremes. But we'll do that next time.